Good afternoon and Shabbat Shalom. I am unfortunately not going to be able to join you at Tefillot over the course of Shabbat. Maybe you can hear from my voice. I have a bit of a cold and have been blowing my nose a lot, which is both a violation of our shul's health policy for me to be present and also is very unpleasant to wear a mask for a long period of time when one has to blow one's nose frequently. So I will miss you over Shabbat, and hopefully I will be able to be back at Minyanim in the coming days. Parshat Lech Lecha is one of the parshiyot that describes the relationship between Avram and his nephew Lot. This is a really interesting relationship. It's one of the only, other than his wife, Lot is the only relative who comes with Avram when he leaves his family and his homeland and journeys to Eretz Yisrael. And this story has many stages, many episodes. This relationship continues into next week's parsha as well. But I want to focus on two moments in this week's parsha, in Parshat Lech Lecha, that tell us something about the relationship between Avram and Lot. The Torah describes in chapter 13 that quarrels began to develop between the shepherds who worked for Lot and the shepherds who worked for Avram. In response to this quarrel, Avram says, we should really separate, and that leads Lot to settle down in the valley. He ends up moving to Stone. The Torah says, "V'yomer Avram el Lot, al na tehi meriva b'ni uvenecha." There shouldn't be quarreling between us, uvein ro'ai, uvein ro'ech, or between the shepherds who work for me and the shepherds who work for you. Ki anashim achim anachnu. We are brothers, okay? And we shouldn't allow this competition over grazing land, this quarreling amongst our employees to drive us apart because we're family. And so the solution Avram offers is to actually separate, and we'll each go our separate ways. And in that way, we'll be able to, carry out our shepherding and live our lives. And in that way, our relationship will be preserved by separating. The Orach Chaim, who's a Moroccan Achron, Torah commentary, he quotes Rashi in source 2, if you're following along on the sheets, and says that the source of the quarrel was an ethical difference between the manner in which Avram and Lot each instructed their shepherds to graze. Lot's shepherds felt that since Avram had been promised the land of Israel by God as the ultimate inheritance of his descendants, and since Avram had no children at that time, clearly Lot was Avram's heir, and therefore he could cash in on God's promise of the land of Israel into being able to have property rights right here and right now. And Lot's shepherds allowed their flocks, their herds, to graze on other people's private property. There was an ethical error, it was a religious error. God did indeed promise the land of Israel to Avram, but that did not mean there was a property right here and right now to graze on other people's private property, and certainly not to Lot, who was Avram's heir, but not, ultimately not the one whom this promise would pass on to. Okay, so based on this understanding, it's the familial relationship, right? He's focusing on the fact that Avram says, "Ki anashim achim anachnu," we're brothers, right? We're fighting, not. We should avoid the cause of fighting because we are brothers, and we need to preserve the ability to have familial, loving relationship within the family. It's actually really quite the opposite. Because we are family, you feel that an entitlement to cut corners ethically vis-a-vis our neighbors, and that has to stop. And the solution Avram again proposes is that we should separate and go our separate ways. The Orach Chaim offers another commentary. This is the third source, and here he takes it another direction. It's Lot's servants' understanding that both Avram and Lot were relatives that allowed them to cut corners and be overly familiar, overly casual with the shepherds who worked for Avraham, right? Avram was a very important person, very influential person, had this mandate from God to one day inherit the land of Israel, but we work for his nephew, okay? So we're close, we're casual, okay? There's a saying, love means never having to say you're sorry, okay? That's wrong. And that's the mistake that Lot's shepherds made. They assumed a certain casual attitude towards Avram's shepherds because each of us work for the same family. And so we don't have to have a respectful relationship because there's this family relationship that can tolerate all sorts of disrespect. And in fact, that's not true. Okay, even within the family, that doesn't enable and doesn't. It's not an excuse for disrespect and for being overly familiar and overly critical and biting and undermining. Right, all of those things that are painful in relationships, they're painful as well within the family. Sometimes they're even more painful within the family. And the final source that I wanted to share is the Malbim, and this is from the following chapter. After Lot and Avram separate, Lot ends up settling in Sdom, and he gets himself into trouble when there's a war that involves the king of Sdom. He's taken captive, and Avram hears that Lot is taken captive. He hears this, and he leaps into action, and he organizes his allies, his B'nai Brit, his those who were in some sort of allyship with him, and he organizes a small army, and he goes and he rescues Lot. So the Malbim, writing in the 19th century, writes, "Vishma Avram siper echid ragesh liba mi'avat hakrovim, hagam shelo titrachek mi'ito, v'lo haya mitarer im hayu lochim et rechusho rak al ma shenishba achiv." It was Avram hearing that his relative, his kinsman, had been taken captive that arouses him to action. If his property had been stolen, he wouldn't have cared. But his brother, right, his brother's son, his nephew, a relative, was taken captive, and this Avram could not abide. This causes him to take bold, decisive action, military action, to rescue his brother. So here we see that even though they separated, Avram still maintains a familial responsibility for Lot, and that continues. We'll see even into next week's parasha as well. So we see this evolution of the meaning of family. We see how Lot's shepherds in source 2 think that family means a sense of entitlement because we're related. We work for someone who's related to this very important person in this region. We can take advantage of other people's property. We can cut corners ethically because of our familial relationship. This maybe we call this nepotism, okay? We see the third source on the page. We see that family can lead to a sort of casualness, an overly familiar attitude vis-a-vis somebody who really deserves greater respect. And this is the love means never having to say you're sorry fallacy. Okay, that's a fallacy that was made by Lot's shepherds. And the final source, the Malbim, is telling us that Abraham valued ethical integrity, yes, but he also cared a lot about family. And I think that's like maybe the core insight of Judaism, that we care about ethics, and ethics means treating every person the same, and having a universal respect for every human being created in the image of God, respecting other people's property rights, even in the land that God has promised to your descendants. And also, we care about our family, our biological blood relatives. That also counts for something, that means something. And Avram displays both of those attributes as he navigates all of the relationships in his life, including this very fraught relationship with Lot. So I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat of peaceful interactions with the members of your family, with the members of your people, and with all people as well.